Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Dongjin Kim. I am ISc Adjunct Professor at School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Studies, Trinity College, Dublin, and Kim Dae-jung Cha Professor of Peace Studies at Hanshin University in Korea. The Irish School of Ecumenics Roundtable webinar will start soon. Please note that this event will be recorded, and please mute your microphone during the webinar for the best sound quality. The webinar will feature a roundtable discussion chaired by Jude Lal Fernando, Director of ISC and Associate Professor, School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Studies, Trinity College, Dublin. As usual, the ISC webinar panel discussion will be in 3 rounds. The first round on panel members' views on topic, focusing on challenges. The second on how to address and overcome the challenges. And finally, an open discussion where we invite the audience to utilize the chat function to raise comments and questions. Please be mindful that for the sake of timekeeping, we would really appreciate it if you would use just the chat function for your questions and comments to the panel members. I will assist Jude in facilitating the third round discussion and make sure that what you contribute to the chat box will be reflected in the discussion today. Now, over to you, Jude.
Greetings to everyone. Thanks, Jin. The ISC webinar series has been going on for at least 2 years. The Irish School of Ecumenics is a cross-border academic institute in the School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Studies in Trinity College. We do have a campus in Belfast too. And the Irish School of Ecumenics is engaged in civic engagement and academic research in the field of theology, ecumenical and interfaith dialogue, peace building understood in its broadest possible terms, including justice, peace, reconciliation, and integrity of creation. And we run several master's programs and a PhD program, mainly focused on the field that I just outlined. And today's webinar, Why Voices of Women? And the question here is, why voices of women? Today, everything we hold sacred has been weaponized against life and its continuation on earth. I refer here not only to sacred faith traditions, but also to modern sensibilities concerning human rights, democracy, women's rights, queer rights, and so on. In the 21st century, the stated justification for wars is not simply to vanquish the so-called enemy, but also to establish democracy from Afghanistan to Iran. Wars have been waged and are being waged to liberate women. Today, we have 5 women on this panel who are in one way or another connected to conflict zones, who are going to tell us a different story. Their resistance and resilience tell us that everything that we hold sacred has not been weaponized and cannot be weaponized and will not be weaponized. With multitude of peoples, they as women hold the world together in the face of a tyrannical rule of a few who are desperate to tear the world apart. Each panelist will have 5 minutes each in the first round and the second round 3 minutes each. And I'll give a signal after each panelist comes to 4 minutes to give the concluding remark. Please keep to the time frame, which will help us to run this smoothly. And in the last round, as Jin mentioned, we will have Q&A and responses from the panelists. And we are grateful to all the panelists who joined us today and to all of you who have joined as participants. Sadly, our first speaker, Nadera Shalhov Kerkwan, fell quite ill last night, and she has sent apologies, and we wish her a speedy recovery. And fortunately, Tasame Ramadan from Nablus in Palestine, at a very short notice, kindly agreed to join the panel. Tasame is the Vice President of the International Union of Socialist Youth, one of the largest international youth organizations in the world. She has an MA in International Relations from ELTE University, Hungary, and has been active in youth issues in Palestine. She is based in Nablus. I will not introduce all the other speakers with the full bio, which you can see. I introduced Tasame as her profile was not on the advertised uh, flyer that we circulated. Over to you, Tasame. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this space. And thank you all for being here today. As the professor mentioned, I live in Nablus. It's a city in the north of the West Bank, a city that has experienced a lot in the past few years because of the occupation. And I want here to begin with saying that I'm here as a vice president of UC and as a Palestinian activist, but I'm also here today as a Palestinian woman who lives under occupation. And this is an experience that theory that cannot explain. It's an experience that you can only understand if you've been through it, if you've lived here as a Palestinian woman. So, for many women around the world, when we talk about the political participation, it means that you have to break social barriers. But for Palestinian women, participation often begins by overcoming the physical barriers, the checkpoints, the military closures, the restrictions on movement, and the fact that you live with constant uncertainty that shapes your whole life. So, under occupation, any ordinary decision becomes a political one because you wake up and you ask yourself, will I reach my workplace safely today or my university? Will I be able to travel if I have to travel to represent my people? Will I be stopped at the checkpoints? Will I lose any of my loved ones today? And sadly, while I was joining you today at this webinar just a few minutes ago, I got a text message that one of my neighbors in my village has been shot dead by the Israeli occupation forces just like an hour ago or less in their invasion of my city, Nablus. But for any other women in the world, when they hear that's the news of losing their neighbor, they would collapse and they would go into this overthinking about like why this happened, are we safe? They would be start to worry. But I'm really sad that my reaction is just to continue at this webinar and just to move on and say what I have to say and represent my people. And I think it's really sad that we've been feeling numb about all of this news, that we do not even react to it as a normal human being, and we do not get to grieve as we should and as we have the right to. So this is the environment that Palestinian women grow and organize and lead in. And yet, I would say that we're not passive victims of the occupation of these circumstances. We are community organizers, and we are union and student leaders. We are journalists. We are caregivers, and we are political actors. We sustain the society even in moments of collapse, like what happened with the genocide in Gaza. And when we speak about what women experience in wars and what women experience under occupation, we should always address what women experienced in Gaza under the genocide. So in the last 2.5 years, we've seen women on the screens grieving their loved ones, trying to take care of their families, and we've seen that women were the biggest losers in wars, not only in Palestine but everywhere. We're always the biggest losers. We're the one who have to step up each time to provide for the family and to care for the family and to be the backbone for our family and for our loved ones. So we've all seen the genocide unfolding in Gaza, and we've seen how these women carried the heaviest burdens, and they lost homes, they lost families, they lost their jobs, their entire support systems. Many of them have been displaced repeatedly. They were forced to protect children without access to food, to clean water, to basic rights like healthcare or even to safety. And mothers have given birth under bombs without anesthesia, without electricity, without any medical infrastructure. Imagine being a woman going into a uh, C-section and surgery to give birth and without anesthesia. So young women have seen their education being interrupted, their future being subs- suspended or even destroyed sometimes, and their basic dignity has been constantly threatened. And we've heard many stories about the sexual violence and the rape cases that women in Gaza experience, whether in Gaza during the genocide or then in the Israeli prisons, where we do not even have a number of how many Palestinians from Gaza are now uh, kidnapped and are being held as captives in the Israeli prisons. And we have no statistics, no clear statistics about how many women are there and what are they experiencing. And because of this fear that they have, they're not even sometimes they do not even have the power, or they do not have the strength to tell the stories of what they've been through, not only because of the political aspect of all of that, but also because of the social aspect of that, because we punish women twice. We punish women politically and we punish them socially. So I would say that war is not equal in the way that it affects people who go through it or under it, because women suffer the most and women experience the most. So when the infrastructure collapse, it's women that must find ways to keep the families alive and going. And when food becomes less and less, it's also the women that uh, like eat the least of all the family members. And when communities are shattered, also it's women. They become the emotional and social backbone. So security is not only about ceasefire or borders. Security is the ability to raise your children without fear, to access education safely, and to move freely and to live with dignity. So from Palestine and to many other like parts of the world, young women are already leading the social movements. They are defending democracy. They are building the solidarity across borders. And they're often doing all of this without protection, without resources, and without recognition. So I would say that as a Palestinian women, we stand between two realities: the global space, where youth empowerment is discussed as a policy goal and as a local reality, and with the reality that women in the other part of the world, they struggle for their basic rights.
Thank you so much, Tasame. What I gathered amidst all what you said, of course, my summary is not really a fair summary, but just to capture, women are the biggest losers. The war is not equal to everybody, but they are the ones who step up to protect life and to continue with life. And now we come to our second speaker, Elizabeth W. Corrie, who is the professor in the practice of youth education and peace building at Candler School of Theology, Emory University in the USA. And there's uh, uh, a connection that I have not mentioned on her written profile. Elizabeth Corrie is the auntie of Rachel Corrie, who was killed by the Israeli bulldozers in 2003 while she was protecting a house that was about to be bulldozed. Over to you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. One small correction, Rachel was my cousin. I'm not that old, although I'm 8 years older than she was. Um, I'll sort of begin by saying that being on a panel like this, especially with someone like Tasame, and being a white US citizen feels a little awkward because I am part of the problem, a huge part of the problem, right? I'm an unwilling or at least reluctant participant in the current war of choice that was started by my country with Israel. Um, and we could have all kinds of conversations about the apparently false assumption that democracies are less likely to start wars. Although you could also say that perhaps it's because the US is no longer a democracy. Um, I will say that um, I at my university, if we go back 2 years, we're on the 2 year anniversary on Saturday, April 25th, of a time when the president of my university called in weaponized, militarized police to immediately suppress the student activists that were encamping in solidarity with the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza in particular. On that day, I was out there with my students. I breathed in some of the chemical agents. And though it is, of course, nothing at all to compare with what is experienced in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon and Iran at this moment, it felt like a huge betrayal that a campus in the United States that supposedly believes in free speech and academic freedom um, tased, tear gassed, and had weapons against students and faculty that were on the campus that day. And we still have not recovered from that. No one has ever apologized to us. And that was before the election of 2024. So that was a precursor of what we were about to experience on a broader sense. So I'll just say, I am 55 years old. I never thought that my rights would be reduced from what they were, from what my mother had. But we are watching in real time the dismantling of women's rights in the United States, beginning with overturning our abortion laws and making abortion increasingly difficult and more dangerous and less accessible, including in my own state of Georgia. We are seeing the dismantling of civil rights for women of color, for all people of color, but women of color in particular. We are seeing activists, student activists in particular, who are literally being kidnapped off the street and being arrested. We are seeing militarized, undisciplined group of thugs that seems to report essentially only to the president, attacking immigrants and citizens. And as you are all, I'm sure, aware, shooting them dead in the streets, as in the city of Minneapolis. So it is a shocking time for someone who did not expect this level of repression to happen in this country, although also recognizing that aspects of this repression has always been the experience of many people in the United States, just not necessarily white middle class people in the United States. I teach youth education and peace building. I work in churches with youth groups and with youth. My main commitment is to teaching, is to helping young people understand nonviolence theory, nonviolence strategy, how to organize for peace, for justice. It is very difficult work. And I'll say, part of it, to answer the question, why wars? In part because we have an educational system that is weaponized, and that creates forecloses the ability to imagine anything other than war as an effective means of accomplishing goals. In the United States, perhaps in some other countries, but I think we're fairly unique in this sense. Our children go to school and have to prepare for the possibility of an active shooter and regularly participate in active shooter drills. When I was growing up in the 1970s, we just had tornado drills and fire drills. But my friends' children's children have to prepare for active shooter drills. And if you don't think that doesn't form someone to believe that life is cheap and that violence is inevitable, I don't know what does. We still operate in a primarily banking education model. For those familiar with the work of Paulo Freire. And so how do you actually teach peaceable ways of being in the world? So I'll simply wrap up by saying that my work is around helping people pay attention to the way you teach, not just what you teach, because you can teach peace in an authoritarian way and actually be teaching war. And you can teach math and biology and French in a peace building way that teaches collaboration, that teaches critical thinking, that teaches imagination, that prepares people to imagine a possibility of organizing society differently rather than around domination, toxic masculinity, white supremacy, and the domination of the earth for pure consumption. Happy to talk more about solutions in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for the correction. Just to sum up in my own way, you have very clearly outlined increasing levels of repression within the US and also connected it to education as a systemic issue where life is being treated cheap and violence is seen as inevitable. And you also pointed towards how to go forward, which we will address, as you said, in the second round. Now our third speaker is Khaldah Salih from Sudan, which is another country that is going through huge amount of massacres, displacement, and rape. She's a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective based in Toronto. Over to you, Khaldah. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the organizers and the fellow panelists. So I'm a Sudanese organizer. I'm fortunate enough to not be in Sudan right now. I am living in Toronto, Canada, and along with other women who are Sudanese women in diaspora, not particularly coming together because we're women, but because that's often how things go. We formed the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which I could talk a bit more about later on. My role in diaspora, which is very fortunate, but at the same time, not by choice, because Sudan is experiencing the world's biggest displacement crisis. I consider to be to uplift the voices of people on the ground, to redistribute our resources from the global north to Sudan, to do what we can to support the efforts that are taking place on the ground in Sudan against this war. So, as most people know and probably have read so many of the headlines to do with the war in Sudan, it's the world's largest displacement crisis right now. I think around 14 million people have been displaced. It's the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It is currently experiencing famine in some parts and acute hunger. Around 25 million people, I believe, in Sudan are facing acute hunger. The numbers go on and on and on and on. And the reason for this massive crisis is not only the war that is taking place between two different factions, as well as their different paramilitaries, different militarized groups, but also the abandonment by the international humanitarian community and the abandonment by international organizations, which is where I think women particularly bear the brunt of that work in terms of the labor of community organizing and war relief efforts. So as with most conflicts, women are particularly impacted, as has been noted many times, and Tasame also noted really eloquently. Women are particularly impacted not just because they carry the burden, that because they are targeted, their bodies are targeted, for example, in the use of rape as a weapon of war, but also because of the way that they must continue to live and to take care of everyone and to have that burden of responsibility, which not naturally, obviously, but does socially fall on women. So in the early days of the war, there's been many stories. Since the early days of the war, there have been many stories of sexual violence against women. Many very tragic stories. I don't want to go into the details, but things that when the war began, Khartoum, which is the capital city, that's where it began, air bombardments and fighting between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese military over the city, causing mass displacement, causing people to flee their homes, and the immediate destruction of social services, of water, electricity, the airports, hospitals, immediately. And people were forced to leave their homes. From then on, the stories of the way that rape was weaponized against women became very, very clear, of RSF soldiers entering a home and sexually assaulting the women and girls in the home, or forced marriages towards RSF soldiers, for example. There have been stories also of the view that one would rather commit suicide than experience rape at the hands of RSF, and a story from a village in the Jazeera in central Sudan of around 150 women who committed suicide together in order to avoid being raped by the RSF when the soldiers came to their village, and all the men had been either detained or killed. So the stories go on and on and on. And particularly also the intense violence, the collapse of food, health, and livelihoods has placed this burden on women. And care work is an essential part of that, but also change in social reproduction generally. The way that Sudanese lives are sustained, the way that societies are sustained look different due to the war. So the stories of Sudanese women in the war are the women who are in, let's say, the urban areas who have remained in Khartoum through the fighting, or the women who are in Darfur, where there is ethnic cleansing and what is recognized in many ways to be genocidal violence. And in South Sudan as well, there's looting and siege and air bombs throughout the country in different ways and different experiences of that. And there is also the mass displacement that's taken place. So many people left their cities in order to go on to rural areas, or are living, for example, in Egypt and so on. And so society has generally reorganized itself, with Sudanese feminist Maya Hassan and Insadaf Siddiq argue is a change in social reproduction and the labor that Sudanese women are doing. In the next round, I could talk a bit more about the efforts by grassroots initiatives, by community organizing, and the ways that women are running emergency response rooms, community kitchens, in the face of all of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khaldah. You have very clearly shown how bodies of women have been weaponized in Sudan and also in other parts of the world. And we have our fourth speaker, Necta Montes from the Philippines. Necta has been in the forefront of the feminist movement in Asia. And in the 80s, she was one of the student leaders who was spearheading the democracy movement against Marcos' dictatorship. Over to you, Necta. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jude. I've decided to write my reflections to make sure that I don't go beyond the 5-minute limit for our sharing. So I focused my reflections on my belief, and perhaps I think this is a belief of many feminist and feminist organizations, that women's place is in the midst of the struggle for liberation. I begin with my context in the Philippines and the voices of those women and men engaged in the struggle to bring about just and lasting peace. My country is in the middle of an ongoing and escalating tension between the US and China. Philippines is part of what is being referred to as the, quote, first island chain, unquote, in the US National Security Strategy, or NSS. These are countries surrounding China, which function is to contain the growing influence of China in the Asia-Pacific region. Under US-Philippine military agreements, we host thousands of US military personnel inside our military camps and bases. At the moment, about 9 military camps. The number of the US personnel is unknown. And we also conduct and host joint military exercises with the US and its allies every year. As I speak, there is a current military exercise with about 17,000 troops in participating. And I believe Japan has also joined this current military exercise. And just a few days ago, our government signed the Pax Silica initiative, where our country will be part of the logistic supply chain, a hub for semiconductor and critical technological production using our own raw earth minerals for the US war machinery. US intervention in our political, economic, and military affairs is one of the root causes of the ongoing internal armed conflict in the Philippines. So what are the key challenges for us in this context? I will highlight only one challenge among a few that I have identified. Increasing suppression and criminalization of dissent and the violation of civil and political rights of our people, particularly groups and individual activists that have been vocal against the war and US intervention in my country. Currently, there are 696 political detainees. 266 of these detainees have been charged with an anti-terrorist act, or ATA. 136 of these are women. This terrorist act is a US prescription contained in our military agreement with the US. It criminalizes legitimate dissents and activism of people. Let me share the case of two very, very young women activists. Their names are Frenchime Cumpio and Mariel Domiquel. They have been in this detention for 6 years now, since February 2020. They were charged with the illegal possession of firearms and explosive under the Terrorist Act. The military illegally arrested, searched, and planted weapons in their boarding houses where they were staying. Both were red tagged as communist insurgents in the social media and in the mainstream media. Frenchie is a community journalist reporting about the human rights violations in the rural communities, particularly those that were happening during the US military and the Philippine exercises. On the other hand, Mariel is a development worker working with the Catholic religious missions, helping the rural communities in their social development programs. Both were active leaders in the anti-war and anti-militarization campaigns in the rural communities where the US-Philippine joint military exercises are happening. Frenchie and Mariel were in their early 20s when they were arrested. When the original charges against them were dismissed by the local courts in 2024, new charges of terrorist financing were filed by the military, prolonging their detention. Frenchie and Mariel's case is just one example among the many cases of violations of civil and political rights and the criminalization and suppression of dissent that fails to make to the headlines of our newspapers. And yet, community activists like them are the most important in raising awareness, mobilizing the people's opinion to resist the war and demand accountability. I would like to end with these words from Agnes Calamard, the General Secretary of Amnesty International and the former head of the UN Human Rights Commission. And I quote, "This predatory international world order, referring to the US-Israel war of aggression, has deep roots nationally. And one of those roots is the suppression of dissent, criminalization of any views and protests that is not in keeping with the government's what the government wants to do and wants to be. This has been eating away the foundation of our democracy." So I guess I'll end with that for now and maybe share a little bit more later about the specific actions and some of the recommendations we will have in the next round.
Thank you very much, Necta. That was quite insightful and detailed. We can see as the US military adventures increase with the full support of their allies from the Philippines, Sudan, Palestine, Iran, there is also increasing level of repression within the US, as Elizabeth highlighted. So this webinar is trying to, in a way, build awareness about this interconnectivity of our struggles. And in your presentation, I found how women are extremely criminalized amongst those who are being criminalized, and they happen to be young women. And that's a perspective that you really brought into this discussion. And our final panelist is Denise Bradley from the Corrie community, who has worked for 25 years with the marginalized men and women in Northern Ireland and the north of Ireland. We are in a peace process, but at the same time, we just cannot be complacent as our destiny and the destinies of other men and women elsewhere in the world are inextricably interwoven with each other. Over to you, Denise. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jude. And I just feel very humbled to be in this space today. So thank you so much. So I would like to share, I suppose, some of my personal and professional reflections from a post-agreement, post-conflict society. And I suppose since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it has been hailed, I suppose, by many as a remarkable document. And yes, we've had a dramatic reduction in overt political violence over the last 20 years. But in my experience, particularly working with women and survivors and marginalised groups over the years, the peace here remains very fragile. And for too many, it's an unjust peace. I suppose to really kind of understand for people living in the island, the formation of the state of Northern Ireland, as we know, is contested and its future is contested. And that makes a lot of people feel very vulnerable. And I suppose it was formed by centuries of imperialism, colonialism, and it was and is deeply entrenched by patriarchal systems. So women are often given the old age narrative that men did the dying and they're the heroes of war, and men are now the great architects and often the saviours of the peace. But for me, working in Northern Ireland, it did not emerge because of these age-old narratives. It exists because women, often who are unnamed, often unseen, came together and still come together in solidarity, despite their perceived differences. They're responding to the traumatic grief and suffering that's been imposed on them by conflict. And I myself, like many women in Northern Ireland, and as Tasame mentioned, women across the world, I embodied the fear and pain while I gave birth to my first child whilst listening to bombs go off in Belfast. So we don't stop bringing in life, we keep going. And I think, why do we keep going? Because we have the courage to hope and embody that hope for something different for our children and something different for our children's children. For me, it has been women who have defied, who have resisted, and are the architects of everyday grassroots peace building here in Northern Ireland. And I suppose even 30 years, nearly 30 years after the signing of the peace agreement, we are still seeing the same age-old systems that has enabled the conflict. Because Northern Ireland was structurally organised and sustained by nationalistic and militarised masculinities, including state actors, paramilitaries, and the patriarchal religious institutions that claim moral authority. This is continuing to influence and shape the North systems, the institutions, and everyday lives, particularly the lives of women. Because everyday violence hasn't reduced, Northern Ireland now records some of the highest levels of femicide in Europe. And every woman that has been murdered here in Northern Ireland, there has been 3 failed attempts of murder on another woman's life. So for women here, the home is now the most dangerous place. And in fact, it's as dangerous now for women here as it was on the streets during the conflict. And I suppose this isn't separate from the conflict, it's an unresolved legacy of a conflict. And it's not just women. Transgenerational trauma weaves through the memories of several generations, as we see day and daily. And this has been transferred and passed into our children. Many are carrying an impossible history. They could be described as present-day containers of wounding and pain, but they have no narrative, they've no story to make meaning of what their suffering has been. And this presents in young people self-medicating, and then are vulnerable to cycles of addiction and criminality. And particularly young men are vulnerable to recruitment into criminality, and young women are sexually exploited, particularly women and girls, often in communities that are heavily controlled by criminality and paramilitary gangs. More people have died to suicide in Northern Ireland since the signing of the peace agreement than died during the conflict. And there's no effective functioning system to support, despite there being systems in place. Communities are still divided. Education is still divided. The Irish language is still contested. And I suppose as we welcome and are seeing people come to our country, seeking refuge and safety from other conflicts zones in the world. They are being placed into divided and contested communities and are being exposed to hate and racism. And in fact, race and hate crime here is now coined the new sectarianism. So people who are perceived as different or a threat are being targeted, and that act of othering is still at the core of Northern Ireland trauma. So as I conclude, I suppose the challenges that I am seeing and experiencing in Northern Ireland, I posit whose stories are we continuing to centre and why? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. You highlighted very clearly, even after the peace agreement, how the plight of women are not better. Now we are moving on to the second round. Each panelist will have 3 minutes each. And in this round, please focus on how you are facing these challenges in different ways, in your own communities, transnationally, and forming solidarity. And please try to keep to the 3 minutes so that we can have all the panelists contributing to the same topic. Over to you, Tasame. And in the meantime, please write your questions and comments on the chat box, and we will gather all of these at the end of the second round. Tasame.
Thank you. First, I want to say that it was so inspiring to hear about the challenges that women face in different places and about the experiences we've heard from all of the speakers. I appreciate that, and I appreciate sharing this space with you and listening to the challenges you're facing. I would say that for Palestinian women, as I said, we should not, when we speak about solutions, we should not talk about theory. We should talk about things in practice that we can do. And we should also start to say that every day a woman in Palestine is already developing ways to overcome these challenges and the extraordinary challenges that they face. So I would say that we would need to have women lead in the communities more. We would need more women to be leading in politics as well, and to see women supporting each other. And in situations where institutions fail or they are restricted by occupation, it's women that build informal systems of survival, and they organize local initiatives. They support displaced families. They provide education for children during crisis. And we saw that in Gaza, where a group of women who were teachers, they started giving classes to kids on the beach, or like in their own like houses or in tents, just to keep the education process going on. So this is just an example of how we face these challenges and how we resist. And again, education is so important. I think if people are educated enough, they would overcome any challenge. And in Palestine, we're really proud to say that we have a very high percentage of women who are educated with high levels of education. So I think this is really helping us to overcome these challenges somehow. And it's the right of every young woman to study and to teach and to research, and this is their own way of defending their right as Palestinians and their right to future. And as I said, the political participation and the storytelling is so important. It should always be the women telling their own stories from their own words, and they should claim more space in political movements, in civil society, and in international advocacy, because sharing their stories and challenges and with their own narrative and their own words, it reduces the it just reduced the idea of them being the victims, and it turned them into being the voices of the survivors and the strong ones. Also, we should focus on the feminist resilience under crisis. And as I said, like women in Gaza and across Palestine, they demonstrate daily resistance, and you can see it everywhere. just by simply starting with their families and protecting their families. So, yes, I'm concluding. So we should not wait to be empowered. We should resist. We should build. We should lead, and we should support each other internationally. Because I will leave this webinar today resting assured that there are other women around the world that are going through challenges that think of Palestinian women, and I will leave today also thinking about all of your stories and all the women facing different challenges and crises all over the world.
Thank you so much, Samami. What struck me most in all what you said, we should not wait to be empowered. We are empowered and we empower each other. And that's quite a profound thought. And take the leadership in the political life. Storytelling is one of the powerful ways of going forward. Elizabeth, over to you.
Okay, thank you. There are several things that are happening on the ground here in the US, and I'm sure I'm just one person participating in a few things. But for those of you who might be familiar with some of the research of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan around how mass movements can bring down authoritarian rule. This idea that 3.5% of the population, if they are actively refusing to cooperate with an authoritarian ruler, will mean that no authoritarian ruler can continue if we reach that threshold. So there has been a mass attempt to teach as many people in the US as possible basic nonviolent strategy using Zoom, using webinars, and that has been, and I've been part of that. They've trained trainers. Last summer was an attempt to train 1 million people around some basic concepts of nonviolent resistance in order to try to topple the Trump regime. That's happening. Coming out of the Minneapolis experience, we are learning that what we need is a decentralized, hyper-local, community-focused system that is able to communicate and mobilize quickly, but is able to show up for our neighbors when they are unable to leave their houses because we are being occupied by ICE. And so in Atlanta, we have tried to build something similar to what came organically in Minneapolis. We have these hyperlocal, neighborhood-based groups that work on food security to help get food to immigrants and refugees who are unable to leave their house and have been cut off from food benefits. And ways of communicating so that if we need to mobilize more quickly to help people to use our own cars to drive people to work, things like that. This is some of the things that we're organizing to do. We are also participating in as many Know Your Rights trainings, right? Really trying to help and accompany people who have to show up for their appointments with ICE for immigration, so that they understand their rights and they understand what may happen if they go into their appointment. They may not come back out again. And we are, one of my favorite things that is starting to happen now is we are reinvigorating the tradition of singing. Singing outside of ICE detention centers so that the people that are entrapped there can hear us in solidarity, singing, inviting the people who work for ICE to perhaps consider leaving, singing to support each other, right? And this is a very woman-led movement, the singing. And in my own life, what did not exist, it was very strong in the civil rights movement, but the organizing I've been doing in my lifetime, the singing had fallen by the wayside. So bringing that back. And I'll just say, for those of you who want to help from outside the US, I would say that the same approach that we have tried for many years with dealing with the state of Israel, boycott. Do not come here. Do not buy American goods. the more people who are starting to realize that that they are personally suffering financially by being part of this war machine, the more likely they'll be able to wake up and become part of our mass mobilization to make change. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I just want to connect, Tasame's storytelling suggestion, which of course is not simply a suggestion, they are doing it, and what you do through singing. Okay, this is very different from men's resistance. Thank you so much for that, and there's so much that is happening, and nonviolent resistance, the land of Martin Luther King Jr., was inspired by Gandhi, and Gandhi has deep connections with Russia's Leo Tolstoy. Many people forget it. So this intercontinental inspiration, which goes from back and forth, has to happen more and more. Thank you so much. And then over to you, Khaldah.
I too am feeling very inspired hearing the stories of everybody, and I really appreciate this. I wanted to start by just ensuring that we center the context of this war as a counter-revolutionary war that is started and took place after the 2019 revolution and is an active event to dismantle the revolutionary movement for a grassroots-led democratic state of social justice, of people receiving the services that they need, and an end to the wars that have entrenched Sudan for, unfortunately, generations. So the context of women's resistance is coming a few years after a revolution in which women were leaders and took an active role and organized and were an essential part of the revolution, as well as a context of violence throughout the country in many of the same areas that experienced that violence, and where, again, women resisted that violence. So I have a few examples, I think, of how women have responded to the war. One of them is in negotiating or in organizing for their own safety. So I heard an example by a Sudanese feminist, Romana Tijani, at a talk she did the other day, where she spoke about women in Dalinj and South Kordofan, which is an area that experienced siege by the RSF, as the RSF and the SAF fought to take control of the area. A pregnant woman had died without receiving health care, and the women in the city organized themselves and negotiated with both the RSF and the Sudanese military, with the RSF and RSF-controlled area, and with the military and military-controlled areas for safe passage of women to healthcare, and they did so successfully. Another example, generally speaking, is of all the work that is the grassroots community responses led by women for women. So community kitchens, for example, which in Sudan we call takaya or a takiya, that are organized to feed people. And again, this is in the vacancy of international humanitarian aid that has failed to respond adequately to the humanitarian crisis, but also comes from a culture of feeding each other and supporting each other, but is in no way distinct to Sudanese people. This is something that we are all capable of in times of crisis, that we can organize together and feed each other and ensure that we're all fed. Much of these community kitchens are supported financially by diaspora organizing, so Sudanese people in the diaspora supporting this. That's the group that I'm a part of, the Sudan Solidarity Collective. And so over the past couple of years, we've raised funds and have sent those funds over. We raised around over $1 million at this point from purely grassroots fundraising, simply from people who are monthly donors, just supporting our work. And we have supported community kitchens throughout Sudan in doing that. An interesting community kitchen or community kitchens initiative is run by the Tea Vendors Union. Tea vendors in Sudan is a very modest profession that is typically done by women, mostly women who are from marginalized and ethnically oppressed areas such as the Nuba Mountains, Darfur, and South Sudan. and they cared for each other. And so they created community kitchens to specifically support each other, knowing that these women are the sole providers and that oftentimes do not have the ability to flee. So unfortunately, in times of war, the people who are displaced are usually the ones with the means to be able to be displaced to begin with. They're the ones with the means to be able to flee. And so many of the people that have stayed in areas of violence are themselves unable to. And so how have women supported each other? And there are so many examples of this. And I think they're not necessarily the examples that are noted in media. They're not necessarily the examples that are noted by policy professionals and so on. And women are largely excluded from any peacemaking process, from anything that has to do with how Sudan will move forward, how this war will end, but how Sudan will move forward. We're in an area of also rebuilding. So Khartoum, the capital city, is at this point free from the war, in a sense, after the rapid support forces have left the city. And for about a year now, the fighting has stopped. Slowly it has stopped, or it's dwindled down, and now it's at a stage where there's not militarized violence anymore, but the city itself, our capital city, is virtually destroyed of all infrastructure, and so many people have left, and now people are returning. So what does that rebuilding process look like? And hopefully that rebuilding process needs to ensure that it is that it not only incorporates women or thinks of women, that women are leading in that rebuilding, that women ensure that the rebuilding of our capital city is essential for us and works for the needs of women, and that they are included in that process. But unfortunately, that is not the case because of oppressive patriarchal systems. And I also just wanted to add that the contributions of Sudanese women in Sudan and in diaspora to feminist literature, to activism, to organizing, to articulating what the war is, to explaining what the war is to so many people globally has been so essential. And again, oftentimes unrecognized in that way. I'll just end by encouraging people, if they would like to contribute to the Sudan Solidarity Fund through the Sudan Solidarity Collective. Our website is sudansolidarity.com. You can become a monthly donor, and honestly, people being monthly donors with $5 a month or so on is how we have managed to raise around $1.5 million to support people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khaldah. What you said was quite striking, that women are leading and rebuilding what has been destroyed and torn apart, and they are negotiating and organizing their own safety. And your emphasis on community building was very, very striking. Thank you so much. And over to you, Necta, please.
Okay. Last March, during the Women's Month, we've launched a campaign to release all the women political detainees, and particularly those women who have been imprisoned due to the Anti-Terrorist Act, which is very recent. So the campaign is centered around trying to connect with other countries that has similar terrorist act and that has been used to suppress and imprison all those people or women who have been involved or engaged in the movement against the war. And I guess we have already been able to do some of those connections with other women's groups internationally. But I think one of the important aspect that I want to share with you is that we do this also intersectionally, because we believe that if you are anti-war, you are also anti-other forms of oppression and marginalizations. So that when we do our organizing, especially in the communities, we explain and we do awareness about the local issues, the national issues that we are experiencing, but also connect this to the problems internationally and particularly what's happening now globally. So I think an important aspect of the work that we're doing also is the people to people exchange, people to people networking, because we think that the state has really failed us, the people, in making sure that the world is going to be a safer place for us and the future. So building solidarity between movements, for example, in the Philippines and in other parts of the world, is key to the strategy that the women's groups and the women's movement are doing now and in the Philippines. We continue to amplify the call to resist the war happening now in Iran, in Lebanon, and in Palestine. And we are very much aware that there's a growing movement internationally, and we want to bring the voices and the experiences of organizers, especially in the local communities in the Philippines. And when I say local communities, so I'm referring to the rural communities, because most of the time we can only hear the voices of the women and also the leaders of the movement that are in the urban areas. We have different perspectives of women and farmers and fisher folks who are living in the rural communities. This is why the examples that I gave you earlier was the case about Mariel and Prenchi, because these are examples of women in the community. No, they're not in the metropolis, but they are doing very, very, very important work in the rural communities. That's all from me, Jude, I think.
Thank you very much, Necta. One thing that I am capturing from what you said is to women's resistance, resilience has to be intersectional. And let me add an old word. I think some would have this, oh, it's an old Marxist term. I would add international and internationalist perspective. I remember back in 2003 when I was in Sri Lanka, in the wake of the invasion of Iraq, I was part of an editorial team of a national newspaper. We carried out the title of the editorial, Let's All Be Iraqis. I had no friend in Iraq, but let's all be Iraqis. And that can be said again and again regarding all these places of occupation, oppression, and women are not only for women's rights, but to focus on intersectionality of different struggles. Thank you. Over to you, Denise. And please do not forget to post your questions, comments on the chat box. We will gather soon after Denise speaks. Over to you, Denise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jude. Yeah, so on the island, both north and south, what we're seeing is, and I apologise, I've got a little dog who might start barking. We are more and more working as collectives, not individually to resist against this individualism, but really starting to defy by working as collective groups, collective approaches, creating spaces for, I suppose, marginalized groups who often are not seen, not heard, not valued, to try and open up those spaces. Again, just what you were talking about, Necta, intersectionality. And I think it's really worth noting in the context of Northern Ireland as a learning, we have had a plethora of outstanding female scholarship in academia, long documenting the layered, complex and gendered impact of war and peace. And yet within our mainstream peace building and conflict transformation, that has been largely ignored and dismissed. So I think it would really benefit to continue now to centre these voices as opposed to the traditional. And again, when we think of patriarchal oppression, I am going to go on about this. It just doesn't affect women. It's affecting all marginalised groups. It's affecting young men in Northern Ireland. And if we want to move forward with a just peace, we do have to really start to call this out. And we do need people to step up alongside, because to ignore it is simply being complicit in women's lives being lost here in Northern Ireland. We have a huge crisis here in Northern Ireland around domestic and sexual violence and gender-based violence. So we're seeing children being orphaned. So it is really imperative that we all stand up in solidarity, because women can't do this on their own. And finally, because I know, Jude, probably with time, I do want to talk about trauma. And trauma and human rights violations are inextricably linked. And we are seeing trauma being passed from generation to generation. And here in Northern Ireland, it is continuously being dealt with westernized biomedical models. So we're resisting that. And we're outside of that because we know that trauma, in order to be fully held and to find space for people to heal and recover, it needs a political and social movement to bring about change. History's told us that. So more and more, we're looking at how do we educate our communities? How do we form collectives where people can bring back power and start speaking into their own experiences, finding language to make meaning to what's happened to them and to validate their stories, because we know that first generation survivors of trauma often cannot grieve. They cannot process what's happened to them because they're in that survival mode. That is then transferred into our second generation who want to forget about the pain that they have no language, no meaning, no story for. So it is now landing on our third generation, who are the generation who do want to remember. And I suppose it's so important for me and for those that I work with and the collectives that are alongside us, that our third generation want to remember with hearts of compassion and care and hope, and not the revenge and hatred that we see manifesting around the world in different places and spaces. So thank you. I'll finish.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Denise. And you highlighted the importance of recognizing intergenerational trauma, which should not be addressed in purely westernized medical terms, but through the community, through a social political movement where women are playing a crucial role. And now we are moving to the third round, taking some of the chat box comments and questions. I do have the first question directed towards Tasame. And thank you very much. I'm reading it. To all of the speakers, this is from Shoni. For all your insight, a question for Tasame. You mentioned that under occupation, every decision is a political decision. Could you tell us more about the experience of this? Could you briefly comment on it, Tasame? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your question. When I say that it's political, it's because every decision under occupation means that you're taking decisions on ordinary things for other people, but for you, because of the occupation, it's not ordinary. So because these decisions are shaped by forces that are beyond your own control. So it's simple. If you want to go to the university, if you want to accept an invitation to travel and speak internationally at a seminar or something, or participate in public life, it all depends on checkpoints. It depends on movement restrictions, on security, like restrictions that are around. So this is for all Palestinians, but for Palestinian women, it's even more, because mobility is directly linked to your independence. So if you do not have the right to move freely, this is affecting your independence. And because of the social barriers, and also that we as a society, when it comes to women, we have more fear about women being attacked or women being, their rights being violated. So people have fear more to let their daughters or their wives out to drive on the streets at night, because of the fear of settlers attacking them, more than they would have on their own, like, male members of the family. So all of these, like, decisions are political, because these are things that you could decide, like, freely without having to worry about it. It's ordinary if you live in a different country, but in Palestine and under occupation, it's political, because it's not controlled by you, it's controlled by occupation. And you can see this also clearly in Gaza, where it's daily decisions about survival, about protecting the families, about finding food, about access to medical care or education. It's all this it's not ordinary anymore. It's survival. So it's political. So this is why the personal and the political cannot be separated in Palestine. It's all connected, and the ordinary things becomes acts of resilience and resistance.
Thank you so much. That's very insightful. And the next question is for Denise. I'm reading it. I assume the people most affected by patriarchal behavior are working class. Is there any possibility of a working class political party emerging which is non-Republican slash nationalist and non-unionist loyalist? Are the Green and Alliance parties too middle class to attract working class support? And whatever happened to the Northern Ireland whatever happened to the Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition? Dennis, briefly.
Briefly, yes. I think to understand what's happening in Northern Ireland in terms of women's position in society goes right back to what I talked about in 1921, because it's not just the conflict, it was pre-conflict as well. So those very nationalistic, masculine, militarized masculinities has always been very much oppressive. And I think that's impacted all classes of people, and particularly thinking about domestic and sexual violence, which is our most common form of gender-based violence here in the North. As I worked many, many years ago, we equally supported as many women in upper class, middle class, lower class backgrounds. So it definitely is about women's position in society and affects all. Are the Green and Alliance parties to middle class? I wouldn't really know, and probably couldn't comment on that. I know that there is noises being made at the NI Assembly at the moment, and there is a very beautiful fancy strategy for violence against women, but actually how they implement it, and because they can't agree between themselves as an assembly, it's often then that filters down into the communities. And that is why we are seeing so much dramatic impact in the North, because we don't have an assembly that can agree policies. And whatever happened to the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. So yeah, we know the Women's Coalition was set up to bring women's voices and all other marginalised voices into the peace agreement. And I think that they finished around probably the early 200s, maybe 2006, after they had felt their job was done and there was starting to be recognition of female political representation in the parties. I hope, Tom, that's answered some of it quickly. Thank you, Jude.
Thank you. At the request of Geraldine, former director of the ISC, one of our colleagues, Necta has kindly put on the chat box the names of the two young women who have been arrested. And their names are, could you pronounce it for me, Necta, if you don't mind? Sorry.
I think it's better to because I think I sent it to you directly, maybe to the group. You can share it, but it's Prenchime Cumpio. The spelling is very hard for me, and the other one is Mariel Do Mekil.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Elizabeth, I do have a question for you. You are living in the belly of the beast. How far the popular mobilization go beyond the Republican Democratic binary?
Are you asking about how many people are starting to mobilize?
I mean, say it's quite polarized along these two major political lines,
yeah.
which are no different to Sudan, Palestine, the Philippines, and rest of the world. When the elephants dance together, the grass can get trampled. When the elephants fight together, it's the grass that get trampled. So what I'm asking is how far the people's movement, is going beyond this false binary.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing in real time the fragmentation of the MAGA movement. And so I do think that that is going to create some new coalitions. But I will say that yeah, we are deeply polarized. I don't know that people on the ground are as polarized as the politicians are because the politicians are incentivized to be polarized. But I will say that we have many barriers to mobilization, and some of it is also age. We have a problem still that mostly it's people my generation and older who are coming out to these protests. And so trying to mobilize young people and trying to create the conditions for people who are now waking up, who may have voted for Trump, making it safe for them to join a broader movement, looking at the example of Hungary, for example, how are we going to get everyone to coalesce around an anti-authoritarian movement? It's very challenging. So to answer your question, I'm not really sure because I don't think that people who are souring on Trump can bring themselves to say that they're Democrat. Um, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party on the ground as well. What I do see are a lot of younger people starting to run for office that are trying to shake everything up. Now, whether we can break through our two-party system would be fantastic. But we've got a lot. I mean, May 1st is going to be a test. I don't think we're going to do all that well, but we're trying to have a general strike on May 1st. And I think that that's what we're going to have to get to. But we're still lulled by capitalism, So I don't know. We're still very polarized, but uh, there are a few political leaders who are reshaping things, like Mamdani in New York, like James Talurico in Texas. These are not necessarily names that would be known internationally, but we're seeing it happen in real time. And so I can't really say what it's going to be until maybe 10 years from now, we'll be able to understand how these things shifted and everything broke apart and reformulated.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As we have only 5 minutes left, I just want to get one kind comment from Khaldah and then move to the final round of comments. Khaldah, there are quite a lot of reports emerging, issued by very high-profile human rights organizations that in Sudan there's a high rate of rape. And do you think this kind of reporting profiles Africa as having highest number of rapes compared with the rest? Because you get my point? How do you respond to that? Because I see it as racially profiling a particular group of people as having more rapists than elsewhere in the world. Any comment?
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of reporting on Sudan is very racist in that sense. Racist towards Africans, racist towards Black people. Even in the way the war is ignored a lot of the time, I think it's intentionally and politically ignored or neglected in the media. It's on purpose that people don't know that much about Sudan, and then the only things that they do know are these sorts of sensationalist, statements, mass rape, and things that have to do with the sexualization of women, unfortunately, or the violence that women experience. I think I don't particularly see it as racial profiling, but I do think it's part of a larger structure in which things like famine, rape, war are synonymous with African countries, with a country like Sudan, and sort of leave people with the impression that this is the way that it is in these places, that this is what they experience, they do it to themselves, when in fact Sudan was going through a revolutionary process in 2019 beforehand. that took many years to get to. And Elizabeth, actually, when you were talking about the mass strike, there were many years of also civil disobedience in Sudan before the revolution, and successfully there were mass strikes of the entire working population essentially would participate. And it takes a lot of work to get to that point, but this is a people that were trying to do that, right? And the impression of the world towards Sudan is not of a people who are revolutionary, are resilient, were trying to organize their own democracy, trying to organize against these systems, but in fact one where there is mass rape, where women experience this, where there's so much oppression, and then it's a mix of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia when it comes to how people think about Sudan. And the other thing I wanted to add is there are so many foreign actors involved in the war in Sudan. This is not just a war of Sudanese people fighting each other. It is a war where the Rapid Support Forces are backed by the UAE, which is actively building their empire. And aside from the UAE, there is involvement of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the US, the list, Russia, the list goes on and on and on in terms of the weapons being sent, in terms of the people fighting over, the Red Sea coast of Sudan. Sudan is partly on the Red Sea. There are so many strategic reasons why this war is happening that it's not simply Sudanese people fighting each other and Sudanese men raping Sudanese women.
Yeah, thank you very much. Shall we go for the final round? 1 minute each, if you can, starting from Tasame. Concluding reflection, very briefly, precisely, if you can.
Okay, so I would say that as a final remarks and reflection on all of that, we can all agree that women are truly the biggest losers in wars, and they are the ones that are most affected. And we've seen how it's different details, but it's the same concept. It's always women who have to go through the worst parts and take the worst consequences of wars and crises. And it's really sad that we're in 2026 and we still see examples of how women's bodies and are being used as a tools in war, and how we reached a point where women are not only scared for the lives of their loved ones or for their basic needs, but they're also scared of being raped or sexually assaulted as a way of humiliating them in wars on crisis. I think it's really important that we should all focus, no matter what, no matter are the details and that are going on with our causes and our issues as women from different places. We should always focus on that. If the women are the most affected, then women should be also the one who are looking for the solution, and women should always be in a place of power where they could make decisions and they are integrating in the political aspect of finding a solution for any crisis. Since they're the ones that are most affected, they could definitely be the ones with the answers and the solutions for it.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'll just sort of speak since I'm the belly of the beast, but a reminder, especially for other people in Europe and the UK and Ireland. My husband actually lives in England and is very frustrated by the fact that the people around him in the UK very much underestimate the threat of the same thing happening there as has happened in the US. And so I just want to kind of conclude by saying, the canary in the coal mine is the way we are talking about women and women's bodies, and this reassertion of a patriarchal white nationalist, white Christian nationalist worldview, right? Don't take for granted if you still have some of these freedoms. Don't take them for granted because we underestimated our threat. I tried really hard to get people to realize the real threat, but people were not willing in some cases to, because of the polarization, because of all kinds of reasons. Kamala Harris was a woman of color, for sexist reasons, for racist reasons, for a refusal to ever vote for a Democrat on the left, too much frustration with the Biden administration around its policy around Palestine, and we did not make the necessary adjustments to stop the huger threat. And that is a real danger, I think, in other parts of Europe and the UK. And so just please do not underestimate that threat and learn from us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Khaldah?
I think my concluding remarks are simply that I hope that I provided some information and some context about Sudan and the war in Sudan, which has been going on for 3 years now and is unfortunately nowhere near ending. I hope that people recognize the Sudanese people as a resilient people, recognize the Sudanese women as a revolutionary people who are leading their own safety, leading their own peacemaking process, and encourage people to engage with literature that uplifts that, to donate to mutual aid efforts when they're able to, and to continue to be in solidarity with Sudan and to build the connections between all these different struggles in their, in the ways that imperialism, that capitalism, that white supremacy continues to harm us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khaldah. Necta?
Yes, I began by saying that I believe that women's place is in the midst of the struggle, and I truly believe this. So I think the narrative that women are always victims, it's true in the war, but also they are in the forefront of the struggle. They are the ones who are fighting directly the enemy. They are the ones who are organizing directly on the ground, both nationally and internationally. So I think the narrative also should shift towards the positive work that women and the women's movement are doing all over the world. That's one. The second thing is that we recognize, I think this is following through what Elizabeth was saying about there is a gap between our generation from the 80s and earlier with the young people. So I think the approach needs to be intergenerational. What we should be doing right now is not just doing our own separate things, but making sure that the actions that we do, both locally, internationally, are consciously intersectional and intergenerational. That's all from my side.
Thank you so much, Necta. Finally, Denise?
Yeah, I think my final thoughts are that women on the island of Ireland have resisted occupation for centuries. And I suppose what I see and what I believe is there is such power in collective, to move away from this individualism, and the power of communities. I mean, I work for and belong to Corrie community, which has been as a community that has existed for 60 years now. And one of the most powerful things about community, I suppose, is that you are able to open your hearts to others who you perceive as different. And I think every one of us here on this webinar today are everyday, what we talk about in Corrie, everyday peace builders, no matter what extremity that we're in. As Elizabeth pointed out, Northern Ireland's already seeing that risk emerge through what's happening to us, because we're always vulnerable to that. So it's about opening our hearts to each other. And it's also often in the simple things, because we're all accountable for sharing humanity and how we share humanity together. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I just want to read one comment here posted by Kamel O'Hara as a token of gratitude to all of our speakers. I quote, "Such a wonderful group of amazing women. Thank you. And we heard your stories, voices, and we heard each other's stories and voices. And this moment is a moment of re-energizing. In the midst of agony, there's hope as we resist. Because as we have outlined on the flyer that we circulated a small phrase from Darwish's poem, life defined only as the opposite of death is not life. So thanks to all of you, and I hand over to Jin. Jin.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Irish School of Ecumenics webinar. Thank you to all the speakers on the panel. Such an inspiring stories that you shared. And we move forward in solidarity onward. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Thank you.
And could